I have the very distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Barbara Perry. She's the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology in Oshawa. So thank you very much for coming here this morning. I'd also like to just briefly, to those of you who may not know her, because I would imagine that many of you do know her, if you've read a newspaper about hate crime in Canada, like in the last 5 years, then you've read about her, because she is the go-to person when the media needs information about hate crime in Canada. When she's not directing the center, she's also a professor and the undergraduate program director of the Department of Criminology in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at her university. She's also formerly associate dean. And I had a look at her CV, which is quite long. I'm not going to read it. I can't even read all of the honors that she's received, so I'm going to pick a couple. In 2013, she was awarded a Distinguished Professor Award from Auckland University in New Zealand. In 2012, she's an honorary fellow of the Department of Criminology at the University of Leicester in England. In 2009, she won the university's Research Excellence Award. And I don't have a year for this, but she was also awarded the Critical Criminologist of the Year by the American Society of Criminology in the Critical Criminology Division. She's also won a whole bunch of teaching awards too, so not only is she an awesome researcher, but a fantastic professor in the room as well. She's written 9 books. Holy cow. And I won't even tell you how many published book chapters, journal articles, reports. She does a lot of work with government organizations to help them to better understand hate crimes and hate groups in Canada. We are so privileged to have her here today in Winnipeg, because March is a very busy month. As most of you in the room know, March 21st is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So people who do Barbara's work are in high demand, not only in general, but particularly around this time of year. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Barbara to come to the podium to give her speech.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I really am grateful to Lori and Shahina for inviting me, and Shahina for hosting me and making me feel so welcome. I'm really humbled to be in this room today with all of you. You do the hard work. You're the people who are on the ground working in the community to build resiliency and to make the community safer and more inclusive and more welcoming. I do the easy work. I just give you some of the information that you can work with. But I'm happy to do the work I do. As dark as it is, and believe me, I have some really dark days on the road and online when I'm looking at some of the websites associated with the groups. And so being in a room like this really inspires me and keeps me moving. These are the bright days. These are the good days. And so I really appreciate you welcoming me to your meeting today. So I want to share with you really a little bit of what I know about the resurgence of the right. And I'm going to base much of what I tell you here today on the report that we published in 2015, which at that time we called a national study of right-wing extremism in Canada. But we were on a shoestring budget, so it wasn't really national. We focused on Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and to some extent BC, because this is where the activity was sort of concentrated during that period of time when we were doing the study. But I want to backfill that with some of our observations of what we're seeing in more recent years, especially the last couple of years. Naming no names, but since a particular election and some elections after that have changed the dynamics quite considerably and changed the context in which we do our work. I want to start by maybe telling you how I got into this work. So I've been working in the area of hate crime more broadly for about 25 25 years. I really don't want to admit that long, but that's a fact. And so it's really only been about the last 6 or 7 years, aside from some work I was doing when I was in Arizona, that I focused on the far right specifically. And that was this project that I'm going to describe. And I came to that project almost out of being annoyed more than anything. Not like I had a passion to look at right-wing extremists, but I was annoyed by this obsession, this sole obsession that I was seeing at virtually all levels of government and in public conversations on Islamist-inspired extremism and Islamist-inspired terrorism, as if that was the only risk in our country, or globally for that matter. And so I submitted my proposal to public safety under what was then the Kanishka program that was funding terrorism and extremism research, and was shocked and surprised that we actually got that funding. And so that's what brought me to where we was. And I like to say I'm brilliant. I like to say I'm prescient. I knew what was coming. Not true. Not true, just pure dumb luck. The good news is, just last week, we had a public announcement. Public Safety came to little old University of Ontario and announced new funding for us for a 3-year study, an update and an expansion of that original study. So I will be coming back to Winnipeg within the next year or so. So any of you who would like to talk to me about what you're seeing in terms of the movement here, I'd really be glad to hear from you. So it's things like this. So what we see here are a couple of versions of the public safety reports on the terrorist threat to Canada. Now, successive reports, and they've been issuing these since about 2012, 2013, and successive reports have really downplayed the threat associated with far-right extremism. Most years there's 1 or 2 sentences to essentially dismiss the fact that there is any threat posed by the far right in Canada. 2015 there was no mention whatsoever of the far right. 2018 was a landmark document. In the, 47 pages, there were actually 2 whole paragraphs on right-wing extremism and the threat that they pose, that they were a growing threat. So that, sad to say, that's the greatest progress we've made in those reports in terms of recognition. I will say, you may remember about 4 weeks ago, Minister Goodale did make some public comments about the fact that they were acknowledging and recognizing that the far right was a growing threat in the Canadian context, and that was one of the first public references that we'd heard. So I was very happy to see that. Next slide, please. Another indication, I think, of our resistance, our denial of the presence or risk associated with the far right are the media and political representations of some of the recent incidents that we've seen associated with right-wing extremism, and terrorism more generally. So this comes from another, just an interesting little project that my colleague Ryan Scrivens and I did, looking at the way that Justin Bourque was represented relative to the way that Zehaf Bibo as well as Cotille Rouleau were represented. So both of them, the latter two, were consistently recognized or labeled as terrorists, as Islamist terrorists in particular. Whereas Justin Bourque, who killed 3 RCMP officers, and was very much informed by right-wing ideology, anti-state, pro-gun stance, was consistently characterized as a cop killer. One of my favorite headlines was, "He terrorized, but he wasn't a terrorist." Right? There was a denial, a rejection of the very idea that this white man could possibly be a terrorist. So that sort of fed into our frustration with the misrepresentations and the misplaced priorities, I think, around extremist threats in Canada. Click again so the left page comes up. There we go. So in that report in 2015, we were able to identify over 120 incidents of violence associated with the far right in Canada between 1985 and 2014 or so. And these ranged from assaults, common assaults, aggravated assaults, up to arson, and up to and including homicides as well during that period of time. So 120 incidents. During that same period of time, we were able to identify 7 incidents of violence associated with Islamist extremism. So I think another indication of that disproportionality in our understanding and response to extremism. I think another indicator of the threat, of the danger posed by those groups, is the fact that just in the last 5 years or so, only in mass homicides, we've seen 19 murders associated with the far right. Of course, 2014, Justin Bourque, who I just mentioned. 2017, of course, Alexandre Bizanet shot and killed 6 Muslim men at prayer outside of Quebec City. And he's very much animated by his obsession with right-wing websites and with the likes of Donald Trump, as you see here, him in his MAGA hat, Make America Great Again hat. And with people like Marine Le Pen as well. So very much, influenced, animated by, inspired by far-right sentiment. And then more recently in Toronto, Alec Manassian in 2018 killed 10 people in the van attack on Yonge Street. Excuse me. Manassian is occasionally dismissed as, sort of a lone actor, not ideologically motivated, but he was very clearly a part of the incel movement, or involuntarily celibate movement, which is sort of one of the misogynist threads, if you will, or pillars of the far right. If we think of the far right as an umbrella movement, there's an Islamophobic pillar, there's an anti-Semitic pillar, there's an anti-gay pillar, and incel fits firmly within that as well in terms of its hostility towards women and especially towards feminism and empowered and strong women as well. So again, very clearly motivated by right-wing ideologies. 19 homicides, and yet the far right is not a threat to national security or to public order. So this is the distribution that we were estimating of the far right in the Canadian context at the time we were doing the study. And again, a very conservative estimate because our emphasis was really on those 4 provinces and on the urban areas in particular. So in the new study, it really is coast to coast. That is, we will be doing interviews and open source analysis in all provinces across the country, and focusing more attention on the rural areas. And I'm sure here in Manitoba, you're much more aware of that even than I am, how active some of these movements are in rural and remote areas. We've been estimating, over the last couple of years, somewhere around, a 25 to 30% increase in the number of active groups in Canada. And then once we started to sort of make our lists and started to actually write down all the groups that we were aware of and collate information from different sources, we're thinking that was very conservative, that there are well over 200, closer to 300 active groups that we've been able to identify just, by following social media forums, that sort of thing. So very extensive. I think that the concentration remains in Quebec and Western Ontario in particular, and Alberta, but there's not a region of the country that isn't affected in some way by the movement. Some of the indicators that we've seen, in addition to those homicides I referred to, is a real renewed campaign of pamphleting and distribution of flyers, posters being put up, in cities and on university and college campuses in particular. So the groups are beginning to recruit much more aggressively on campuses and to hold or attempt to hold rallies and open forums in those contexts as well. So you can see here some of the posters that have been appearing in communities across the country. Make Canada great again, by which of course we read Make Canada White Again, as Make America Great Again is read as Make America White Again. tired of anti-white propaganda, just on and on. I mean, these sorts of images are appearing. I'm sure you've probably seen them in your own communities as well. Next, please. And another indicator, another indicator is our hate crime statistics. Now, not to say that right-wing extremists are responsible for, a great deal of the hate crime that is reported. Estimates are generally about 15%, 10% of hate crime is associated with people who are direct affiliates with groups and would admit affiliation with specific groups. But the presence and the very visibility and the loud voices that they've been sharing over the last couple of years are also part of that climate, a part of that narrative that's circulating that contributes to an environment of hate and hostility directed towards all others really in our midst. So I think that they also play an indirect role in driving up the amount of violence and property crime directed towards targeted communities. Most dramatically, so in 2014, 2015, we were seeing increases around 3 to 5%. This past last set of data we have for 2017, 47% increase in police-reported hate crimes. 47%. If that had been any other category of crime, what would have happened? There's a crisis. There's a crisis. We need an inquiry. We need more funding. We need more programs. We need to intervene. What do I can't do a cricket impersonation if I could. That's what I would do because there's been dead silence on what this means, what the implications are, what the consequences are, what the impacts are on targeted communities. What message does that send to immigrants, to Muslims, to people who have been impacted? And if you look here, which is really hard to see, this is an infographic that accompanied the sort of the brief report that came out. An extended report on the 2017 data are due out in April. But this is the first time they've done the infographic, and I think it's a really quick and dirty way to see what the data represent. Most of the increase has been in Ontario and Quebec, and most of the increase is accounted for by violence and property crime targeted toward Muslim and Jewish communities as well. And you're probably very much aware of that from the work that you do in terms of media reports and if you have informal reporting mechanisms, I'm sure you're seeing that as well. And I would argue in particular in terms of the anti-Muslim violence, if you look also on the left-hand side, we see the increases along racial and ethnic lines. And you see a dramatic increase there of violence also. Well, less dramatic, but still dramatic, increase in violence against South Asians and against Arab and Arab communities as well. So I think there's some elision. If you think about, in the popular culture, the popular psyche, there is a tendency to confuse being brown with being Muslim. So I think that there is, that we have to recognize that intersectionality there in terms of people being targeted both because of their religion and because of their perceived religion and perceived racial or ethnic identity as well. And of course, in our data reporting mechanisms, we can only count one motivation. So it's either religion or race, not both of them. So we can't unpack that intersectionality. So when we were doing the study, what we were looking for was not just a simple quantitative count of how many groups there were and how much activity they were engaged in, but also what it was that was driving them or driving them down. So we were looking for factors both internal to the groups themselves that would explain, what sustained them and what helped them to develop and to grow, as well as those factors internal to the groups that inhibited them, that rendered them relatively weak and disorganized in some areas, as well as the external or exogenous factors that shaped their sustainability. So what was it about the communities or the climate in which they found themselves? So the things, I think I'll just highlight a few of these endogenous factors. And in particular, I think maybe I'll just speak to this first one in terms of the facade of legitimacy. And that is something that has, for some time, been an important part of the movement. Since David Duke, the grand wizard of the KKK in the 80s said, take off your white gowns and your hoods and put on your business suits. And we've seen a sort of a resurgence of that with the likes of the Proud Boys and those who call themselves the alt-right, rather. They're just the right. There's no alt about them, same thing, except for their presentation of self, which is much more suave representation. What we might have called in the 80s or the 90s, that preppy look with their polo shirts and that sort of thing. So they're representing themselves as very credible and educated and urbane, as opposed to our more traditional image of the far right, which is the skinhead neo-Nazi look in their black jackets and their shaven heads and all of that sort of thing. We still see some of that, but there is also an important element of the movement that is presenting itself and its ideologies in sanitized forms, trying to remove explicitly racist language and using much more coded language. And I think that is, again, a troubling trend that we're seeing. But I think that the sort of the two in the middle, the music and the facility with the internet, are probably the most important factors for the movement, both in terms of recruitment, bringing people into the movement, but also in terms of building solidarity within the movement once they're there. So the music is a really interesting area. So I've mentioned how dark the work is. For fun, one of the projects that we've been working on is looking at white power YouTube videos. So we came in. I think we thought there was some diversity there, but we thought most of it was kind of headbanging music, can't understand lyrics. And there is a lot of that. And a whole array of different genres of metal music. Heavy metal, black metal, Oi, Race Against Communism, RAC music. But we also saw a number of other kinds of music, which is even more concerning, and that is there's a lot of folk music. Pretty music, lull you to sleep, lull you into the messaging, and the narratives are there. Some of you might remember George Birdie, who was the founder of Resistance Records, which was the largest, based in Toronto, was the largest distributor of white power music through most of the 90s, late 80s into the 90s. He seemed to disappear from the scene. He's now living in sort of central Ontario, not that far from where we are. But he'd been out of the movement for about 10 or 12 years, but he's back on the scene. He's just released a folk CD with a young woman musician. And it's just lovely music. It's really peaceful and calming, most of it. And then you listen to the lyrics, or you read the lyrics, and it's really quite troubling. The other area is country western. The country western is nearly as popular as the metal music. So metal music, like Screwdriver, which is one of the early bands, and more or less defunct now, coming up in different versions, will have 1 million, 2 million likes. The country music is not that far behind. It has 800,000, closing in on 1 million, and there's more and more of it online all the time. The frightening thing is how close it is to sort of mainstream country and western. If you think about some of Hank Williams' early music, for example, there were really strong racist and misogynistic themes in that music. There continue to be, to some extent, some of those themes, especially the misogyny, less so perhaps the blatant racism, but so it's there's a legacy there, I think, that the movement can draw on. But these sort of the popularity of these other forms of music, I think, are really conscious efforts to broaden the audience. right? To bring in a different demographic. And that is also something that we're seeing in the last few years in terms of a change within the movement. When we think about the skinhead movement, neo-Nazi movement, they're youth and young adults, 17 to 24. Most people leave the movement by the time they're in their mid-20s. Some of the leaders may stay on for longer periods of time. But we're seeing an upward trend, I think, in terms of both age and socioeconomic status associated with members of the movement. So if we think about the Poor Yellow Vesters movement that has been, hijacked and co-opted by the far right, that element of the movement is, that's they're middle age, right? They're not 20-year-olds, they're not 17-year-olds, they're 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and most of whom are employed. Risk loss of jobs, but employed. If you look at those alt-right members, many of them are, well-educated and, have relatively well-paying jobs. They're quite comfortable at the very least. So that's a really important change in the demographic, and I think that, the growth in this music is an attempt to further rein some of those segments of the population in. And of course, where is that music found but online now? You can still get CDs. I took into class the other day to my students when I did a little bit of work in this area when I was still teaching at Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, and the internet was just nascent then. That's how old I am. And so I brought in these little cases that had these things with 2 sets of wheels and tape in between. I said, you know what this is? These were the cassettes that I had purchased, I hate to say it, from White Aryan Resistance. And I had some newsletters as well. So there's been, the internet has been an incredible boon because it makes this access to, the music, but also to the websites and to the narratives and the messaging, makes it that much easier for them to disseminate and to engage with one another. And I think that that's a really important thing. There's a lot of recruitment that goes on online, especially as people go searching in these days for answers to their questions. This is one sort of element, one movement that is accessible to them. But it's also, and we mustn't forget this, it's also a very important site for identity work and for building identity. So when they were reading the newsletters in print, when they were calling in to the phone lines that would just give them a message, when they were listening to the music on cassette tape, that was a one-way transmission. The internet allows incredible dialogue and engagement, even through through Skype and teleconferencing and all of that sort of thing. But certainly through the comments section on the music videos, through social media forums, all of that sort of piece, so that they're able to share that back and forth in terms of reaffirming one another and confirming their views of the world. And not just their little piece of the world here in Winnipeg or in Toronto or in Canada, but in fact now it is a global movement. It is in all respects a global movement. So if you look at Stormfront, which is the longest lived forum, right-wing forum, there are sub-forums for a couple of dozen different countries, including Canada, obviously. So there's an exchange across borders here, so that when they talk about the nation, they're not just talking about the nation of Canada and their brotherhood here, but they're talking about the great white nation that brings together brothers, primarily, from Scandinavian countries, from Australia, from the UK, from Canada, from the US. So imagine how empowering that is to know that you're part of something so much bigger that crosses those national boundaries and international boundaries. On the flip side of that, so those are the sorts of things that bring the movement together, that give it some strength, give it some sense of solidarity. The last one I forgot to mention, we can come back to that, is the notion of building connections. And that is, so those international connections, but also what we're seeing more recently, a lot of conversation in the media about the role of former and current military and law enforcement personnel in the movement. We're seeing more and more evidence of that. I mean, we've known that from the U.S. for decades. I mean, there was a time when, you know, you couldn't be a sheriff unless you were a member of the local KKK. Not quite as extreme as that now, but there is still a lot of connections between them, and we're certainly seeing more of that. And I think that that is also a disturbing trend, as we'll see when we look at a specific group later on. Okay, so those are some of the factors within the group that, you know, provide strength and momentum, but there are also a number that have the capacity to weaken them. These are points of vulnerability where we can intersect to weaken them and to dismantle them. And a lot of it revolves around the strength of their ideological commitment and unity within the movement and within particular groups. So for a lot of people who come into the movement, they're often very confused individuals. They feel marginalized, often not necessarily economically, but certainly in terms of feeling like they don't have a place to belong, that they are outsiders in some respect. You know, in the incel movement, for example, you know, can't get a date. Women don't pay attention to them. So they're looking for answers. One officer referred to it as they're trying on different coats to find one that fits. And so the depth of their commitment isn't always very strong as they come into the movement. They find out maybe it's not extreme enough or too extreme, and they move on to something else. And that's also connected to this notion of infighting. That is that they're not very, that when we were looking at them, they were not very stable in many respects. There was a lot of morphing and breaking off into smaller and smaller cells. Which, you know, had the impact actually of spreading their effect, because each of these new cells would bring in new members, so it actually grew the numbers rather than reducing the numbers. But nonetheless, you know, you can prey on that or play on that ideological infighting as a way to I guess, weaken them and further the level of disorganization amongst the movements. And some law enforcement services had been pretty good about that at that time, and so that leads to this transience in mobility. So at that time when we were doing the study, I would say that Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton in particular, were especially effective in their reaction and response to an awareness, just awareness of the presence of the far right in their cities. So, you know, Calgary would, have them under surveillance, and literally when people would move into the town. So there were a couple of leaders like Kyle McKee who left Western Ontario, and cops in Western Ontario called Calgary and said he's on his way, and when he showed up, they knocked on his door and said, "Hey, welcome to Calgary. Glad to see you. We'll be watching." So when things would get too hot in one city, they'd move on to another, and it'd get too hot there, and they'd move around. So there was a lot of transience there, and that was the result of the law enforcement response and the response of anti-racist groups in the community as well. So those were points that could be exploited. The other piece is that people who come to the movement, they don't come to the movement and then they become violent. Often violent people are drawn to the movement because they see it as a venue for, expressing those violent tendencies. So they come into the movement very often with a history of violence, often with a history of criminal convictions. So eventually, chances are they're going to screw up again, and they're going to be arrested. So again, Kyle McKee, multiple offenses over the course of his career. But when they commit crimes, and often unrelated to their ideological position, so it wasn't necessarily hate crime, but guns offenses and drug offenses and other kinds of violent offenses. And so often the leadership or members, multiple members would be arrested and charged and imprisoned. So that obviously decapitates the movement and weakens them as well. So, their violence can be used against them in that respect. Next, please. I'm a sociologist by training, so for me, what's really interesting are the historical and cultural context in which these groups emerged. So we're very interested in what was happening in those communities where there was a particular concentration of the movement, and we've certainly seen more and more, what an environment, what a climate of hate can do to embolden the movement. One of the most dramatic things we saw, of course, was that there was a very weak, I'm going to say relatively, I'm going to say very weak law enforcement response and recognition of the far right in many of the communities we visited. Even in some of the cities in Western Ontario where, pretty much everyone in the province knew that there was a great deal of right-wing activity, even at that time, law enforcement would say, no, not really a problem here. No, we're much more worried about the left wing, or we're much more worried about the freemen on the land or the sovereign citizens, and really a denial. There was one officer who said, yeah, we know they're here, but until something happens, we're not going to worry about it. Would they have said that if someone said, oh my God, I think there's a cell of Islamist extremists in the city? Oh no, they'd have been all over that. So real frustration there. There was one, don't think it was the same city, it was another city where there was a rally that had been planned, sort of a parade by one of the white power groups, and they were able to trot down the street with no police presence. It wasn't even on their radar. They weren't even aware that, that such an event was planned. So there was no one there to act as a buffer between them and their anti-racists there. And that was quite common. That sort of denial of the threat was very common across the country, with some few exceptions, as I've mentioned. And also, the Sûreté in Quebec were very good. They were probably the most forthcoming and the most aware of what was happening sort of across the province, not just in Montreal and Quebec City, but in some of the northern regions as well. So that was where we first became introduced to the 3 percenters, for example, who I'll talk about in just a moment. The media misrepresentation I referred to earlier, right, in terms of how we talk about terrorism and who's a terrorist and what is terrorism. But the more important thing, and I'm going to leave it here because I come back to it, is that the political and rhetorical climate in which hate emerged. And we'll skip on because I come back to that more concretely in a moment. And there are also some inhibiting factors. So as I mentioned, there are some law enforcement services that were very strong in this area, that were very much aware of the activity in their own communities, and were engaged in strategies intended to counter the movement. And so in areas like that, it was possible for them at that point to weaken the movements and at least to move them on so they were somebody else's problem, which is not necessarily a great solution. The other piece is, whether there is a strong presence of an anti-racist or anti-fascist movement. And, there were some areas in Saskatchewan, for example, in Regina, where, human rights activists were complaining about how much the movement had declined in recent years, and that didn't have that same presence that it had in, say, the 80s or the 90s, and wasn't as well prepared to counter the far right. And I think that in a lot of communities now, we're starting to play catch up, where organizations, anti-racist, anti-fascist organizations and coalitions are having to build themselves up, rebuild their capacity, if you will. And we're certainly seeing this in the labor movement right now, where there is an increasing attention to the presence of far right activity, but within their own membership. And so thinking ahead to the next election, the federal election, you can be sure it's not going to be pretty, that the members of the movement are going to come out of the woodwork. You think about what's going to happen around Maxime Bernier's party, for example, and the labor movement is really gearing up for that, trying to enhance the awareness and sensitivity of their membership. So I think that that's an important thing, and I sort of feel that energy here, and I think that's so important to have that kind of presence as a inoculant, if you will, against the movement. Okay. And so one of the turning points, I think there have been many turning points, but one of them, of course, even for the Canadian movement, was Trump's campaign for leadership and subsequently campaign for presidency, and then winning the presidency. Next slide. But I think that, sure, we'd like to blame Trump for all of the ills in Canada, but we've had our own history, our own problems, if you will, in terms of preparing the soil for the growth of the movement. So, sort of what I refer to as normative Islamophobia, normative hate more generally, because you see here it's not just about Islamophobia. Stephen Harper, I think in the last election and in his last administration, I don't think I'd ever seen a federal, never mind politician, a federal leader express so much anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment as he did. Statements like Islamicism is the greatest threat to Canada, referring to the niqab as offensive. Oh my gosh, okay. And attempting to reverse same-sex marriage early on in his administration. Marois in Quebec, of course, with the Charter of Values, which would have constrained sort of Muslim expressions of self and identity in particular. Of course, Trump, what more can we say about him? Kelly Leach, it was Kelly Leach actually that introduced to Harper the notion of the hotline for barbaric cultural practices, and then of course, tried to double down on that in her run for the campaign. Trump was successful. Perhaps I can play that card as well, and so also then introduce this notion of screening immigrants for Canadian values, whatever they are to her, certainly not my values. And then even more recently, Legault, the current premier of Quebec, who said, and this was just mind-boggling, I don't think there is Islamophobia in Quebec, so I don't see why there would be a day dedicated to Islamophobia. This on the anniversary of the homicides in Quebec City. I think you can ask survivors there. You can ask, I think, probably most members of the Muslim community in Quebec. I think there's considerable disagreement there. And so that all frames very much the growth of the movement, whereby they feel enabled, empowered, emboldened by our political narratives circulating in the broader culture. So I was going to run through a number of groups and tell you a little bit about them. Clearly we don't have time, but just to introduce you to some of these jokers. Proud Boys, all-male group. There is a Proud Boys Girls club. Yeah, not quite sure about that. And this is when they started. I thought, oh, alt-light. They're just a bunch of frat boys, but they become increasingly aggressive. And you see here a reference to "We love our guns," and that's again a new trend that we're seeing within the movement. Next. Okay. Blood and Honor is a long-lived group. They've been around probably since the 80s, derived from their British counterpart, but have experienced a resurgence, a regrowth in recent years. So now, again, multiple chapters across the country, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec in particular. Soldiers of Odin, oh, everybody knows Soldiers of Odin. I think they're in most large cities. I'm guessing there's a Soldiers of Odin group here. They're just doing good community works. They're cleaning up our parks. They're doing street patrols. They're surveying mosques and Muslim community centers, and they're cloaking that under the guise of community safety, which invokes the stereotype of Muslims as dangerous. Yeah, don't let them fool you. Next. Northern Guards, here's where we talk about schisming. The Northern Guards hived off of Soldiers of Odin, as did, next one, the Storm Alliance. These folks are, with Soldiers of Odin, are involved not just in the street patrols, but border patrols as well, at the crossing points where irregular migrants are coming across. And so, they, go back to the last image. Yep, okay. So they're not typically armed, although sometimes the 3%ers come armed, but many of them show up, regardless of what group, in these uniforms, these black jackets. So these do hark back to some of the more traditional neo-Nazi groups. But they don't have to be armed. They don't have to do anything at the border patrols. Imagine these, however many, 9 guys standing at the border like this, big guys. That's intimidating in itself. that certainly doesn't make you feel welcome or safe crossing that border. So I think absolutely something that we need to be cognizant of. Okay. Okay. Pegida, you're probably all familiar with Pegida. It's from the German acronym Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West or the Occident. And so this is a German group that now has chapters across the country, and we think probably at least 6 chapters in Canada. There's Pegida Canada, as well as multiple provincial chapters. Single issue group really focusing on Islam and vilification of Islam. The threat of terrorism, the threat of Sharia law, the threat of, is one of their signs says, rape and assaults on our women. So again, that negative constructions. Okay. And that World Coalition Against Islam as well. Again, an international organization and a single issue focusing primarily on Islam. So again, you see here the Make America Great Again hat worn by one of its leaders. Okay. And Lamut, based physically in Quebec, but much of its activity is online. They were created in 2015 by 2 former military personnel, and they soon claimed to have 40,000 members online. And now they're claiming, something closer to 60,000, 56,000, I think, online. Now, what that means to have that kind of membership online, not really clear, and probably an exaggeration. But Lamut is very active in also organizing, strategizing around the rallies that we're seeing. Okay, next. Atalante, again, a Quebec group, and some of you, your French is probably better than mine, but as best as I can tell, this says, "Death to terrorists, Islam out." This group is so extreme that most of the other extremist groups have distanced themselves from them. How bad do you have to be? So again, very dangerous and very much under the on the radar of Sûreté. And the 3 percenters. This is the most frightening group to me. This is one of the groups that does claim, and people claim self-identifying as former and current military and law enforcement personnel. They're armed, they're heavily armed. They show images, you can see here with their guns, but they show images of themselves with their caches of heavy arms, automatic weapons, stacks and stacks of them. Photos of themselves engaging in military and paramilitary training, which is illegal in Canada. Yet they're very proudly representing that in their photographic images. So for me, the danger is obvious. Racism, guns, and the training to use them. And they provide security at the rallies for some of the other groups, which is sort of the other trend that is worrying. The coalition building that we're seeing across the movement. Certainly when, I am there. Certainly when we were doing that project, there was not only infighting within groups, but a lot of conflict across groups as well. But we're seeing a reversal of that now, where the rallies are attended by multiple groups. They're working together online. They're strategizing together online. And they're not separate. So they're trying to, again, increase their sense of power and their visibility and attempting to empower themselves. So again, I think very dangerous trends. And you see here some more of that solidarity building where you have multiple groups. I think the one on the right, even the JDL, were in attendance at that one. Okay. So this would be my conclusion, and that is, 3 elements that I really highlight. There's so many strategies that we could use, but for me, the highlights are really to educate and increase awareness, popular awareness, first of all, because I think the general public is really not aware of the extent of the activity associated with these groups, the dangers associated with these groups. Our politicians and law enforcement intelligence personnel also need to be made aware. I've been pounding on doors and screaming and yelling since 2015 when we published this, the report, getting people to listen. I think there's finally some uptake. We're finally beginning to pay attention. Education is important. And if you can just scroll down actually to the next slide. So that's our Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. Don't forget us. But this next one, so the photograph that you see there on the left is our dear Premier Doug Ford. We're sorry. Posing during the last municipal election with Faith Goldie, who is one of the front people of the white nationalist movement in Canada right now. Took him 3 days of concentrated pressure from the public, from other politicians, to kind of distance himself from Faith Goldie. That's not the kind of action we need to see from our leaders. The kind of action we see on the right, which was Iqra Khalid introducing Motion 103, condemning Islamophobia and all forms of discrimination, that's the sort of action we need to see. Our mayors, our local politicians who stand in solidarity with anti-racists and anti-fascists at rallies and demonstrations, those are the kinds of actions and gestures we want to see from our politicians. And then finally is resistance and continuing to resist and to challenge and to push back, to continue to outnumber the racists and the fascists at their own events. And I think that is so much of the work that you do. And so again, I end with being humbled by the work that you do on the front lines to challenge us, and I know you'll continue to. And I think that the work, the toolkit that's going to be introduced today will be an important mechanism to help all of us to continue that resistance. So I thank you very much.
So, because we're a bit behind on our time, I'm going to only take 3 questions, and I'm going to take them all at once so that Barbara has a chance to address at least 3 questions, but she's going to be here all day today and in the morning tomorrow as well, and would be happy to talk to you if you had questions. So...
And to take names of people who would like to talk to me when we come to do interviews.
Absolutely, yeah. You can put my name down. Who would like to ask a question? Yep.
So a response to right-wing extremism and white supremacy that we often see on the left is that these groups should be treated like terrorists. But I think if we recognize that the way that terrorism has been formulated in Canada is fundamentally racialized and premised on the erosion of basic civil rights and liberties, this approach might actually end up further entrenching and legitimizing problematic practices of counterterrorism. So I'd like to have your thoughts on how we can formulate a responsible response on the left and among anti-racists to the threat of right-wing and white supremacists.
Question number 2.
And we have a mic here for the, sorry about that. We have a mic here to just wave your hand. Okay.
Go ahead, Ruben.
My question is, you mentioned about the need for public educations. What are some of the strategies to do that, given that public nowadays it's indifferent in terms of, taking pro-actions in terms of issues like this?
And question number 3.
And finally, you mentioned rural Canada. We're all probably from the city in here, so could you just comment a little bit about what you're seeing in rural Canada?
Okay.
Okay, so the first one is, and there really is a risk. I mean, takedowns online and, designation as terrorist entities, all those sorts of things, those real sort of punitive responses often do have a backlash effect, an unintended consequence of feeding into that victim mentality that is so much a part of the movement. So they use that as a way to say, well, look, we're being silenced. We're the ones whose rights are being quashed. You can have a gay pride group, but you can't have a white pride group. And so it is a real challenge there. And I think that sort of extremism on the left and extremism on the right are problematic. So violence obviously isn't the solution that we see in some of the rallies. I think that the kinds of resistance that we have seen at the rallies, I think the kind of actions that some of the law enforcement that we were working with engaged in terms of a heightened surveillance of known members, so that they were vulnerable to not hate-related charges, because that does feed into the mentality, but the violent offenses that holding them accountable for the other violent offenses that eventually they're probably going to commit. And I think too, one of the things we're seeing is more property crime, theft, robbery. So taking them down on those sorts of charges. So I think part of it is law enforcement and intelligence communities being aware and actively engaged in responding. That was the first one. What was the second one? The second one was about public education, right. we always talk about what can we do in the schools? How can we, educate our kids about this? And yeah, that's important to develop these. I've had my students involved in building online and offline responses to hate. One of the things that they did was build a workshop for high schools around right-wing extremism. What does it look like? What does it look like when someone is trying to recruit you? How do you interpret or identify their narratives when you see them? And I think that that's really effective at the public school level. But as I said, what we're seeing is more and more engagement amongst working age people, middle age people, and that's where I think the labor union is really has an important labor movement has a really important role to play in terms of educating their membership, engaging in days of action, the things that directly confront the people who that generation that are vulnerable to the narratives. And I think that in general we need to take seriously some of the real fundamental material conditions that are giving rise to the anxieties. We do need to pay attention to, the threat of job loss in the energy sector and the oil industry in particular. We absolutely need to respond to that. I think we can learn from the last American election in terms of, we can't deny the foundations of those anxieties, that we have to address those as well. So I think the labor movement is so important, and we'll continue to work with them. And then the last question was rural Canada. Yeah, even when we were doing the first project, we're hearing glimmers, people in the cities saying, you should be talking to the folks in, they're saying in Alberta, in Red Deer, some of the outlying communities, and we just didn't have the resources then. So we knew it was happening then. Folks like the 3 Percenters and which one? Storm Alliance, those that are armed and training, they're very active in the rural areas. They may be drawing from the rural areas, but they certainly have sort of camps, if you will, where they're engaging in that paramilitary training I referred to earlier on. So we did hear about it then. We didn't have the resources to explore very deeply, but this time we absolutely will. And we know that it's happening in virtually every province, in some of the rural areas, and not just remote rural areas. I mean, even in Ontario, we think about parts of Western Ontario as being relatively rural, and that's certainly a hotbed. They're drawing people from London or drawing people from, the farm communities in their area. So it is definitely an important part of the movement. And because it's in the rural areas, I think it's a little more hidden and more problematic in terms of digging them up. So, yeah, so I'm here all day. Don't forget to tip your waiter. Yeah, please do grab me aside, pull me aside during break and lunches, and absolutely very happy to talk to all of you. Anyone? Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to get you to join me in thanking Barbara.